Well, today on Rebuilders, we continue the conversation about neoliberalism, but looking at the way that it spawns burnout culture.
Burnout culture is a topic that is everywhere. And more and more people are sort of wondering, am I burnt out? The great pause of COVID caused people to rethink, and we see all kinds of things from go slow, work your wage. This week we saw Snail Girl. When should you retreat? When should you rest? And how does neoliberalism shape all of this? And what if there's actually more going on than perhaps seems like it on the surface?
Yeah, it's a really interesting episode, and we are ready to get into it. Hi, welcome to Rebuilders. My name's Liddy, and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both today?
We are good.
Yep, doing
I'm
great.
speaking on your behalf.
I affirm that.
But something, we're good because we are celebrating because something happened.
It wasn't that I washed my hair this week.
Did you?
No, I didn't.
Have you washed your hair
okay.
since
No,
our previous episode?
No, I'm standing with my
All right.
position on hair
Okay,
washing.
so that's not what we're celebrating.
Actually, sorry to
No, don't
call
apologise.
attention
Go
over
on.
here. I did have a number of people on my side affirming.
What, Rebuilders listeners?
Yep.
Yeah.
So have you got your own little emails you're getting from our listeners that you just keep in your own folder of like unwashed follicles?
No, and there's this whole thing against big pharma or something.
Oh, come on, man. Come on, man. We know where this goes.
Anyway. I haven't washed my hair since the last episode.
Did the World Economic
you.
Forum, control us from our hair washing? Daniel will be starting his own podcast called the Internet, the pushback against the international conspiracy of shampoo.
One to look forward to.
Endorsed by the WHO.
Yeah, WH. Yeah. Oh man. It should be called Big Shampoo, not Big Pharma. Big Shampoo.
I don't know. Big Pharma are one of those big kind of multi-billion-dollar.
Yeah, I started watching that video that you sent through to us.
That was good, wasn't it?
I refuse because I can spot disinformation from a mile away.
Very good.
Alas,
Alas.
there is some other even bigger news.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is some real news.
Yeah.
This is not a conspiracy.
No. Well, I don't think it is. Gosh. I got engaged.
Woo!
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm trying to do
Times.
crowd noises going mad, but there's only me and Daniel.
It's very impressive. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. The
Congratulations.
other weekend. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for our listeners, who is the lucky man?
Stephen, he's semi-on team, so he works for 24/7 Prayer Australia.
Yep.
Yeah, great guy. Pretty happy.
Yeah. No, we're happy, and we fully endorse. We fully endorse this.
He does wash his hair also, which is nice. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what you're looking for, really.
Yeah, that was the starting point.
Yeah, that's what you're looking for in a fellow human being.
Yes, I will spend my life with you because you wash your hair.
Yeah, yeah.
Are you going to
good.
write into your vows?
Yeah.
Yes, it's already in there. Yeah. Yes,
In
very
washing,
exciting.
in washing day and non-washing day.
Oh, wow. Well, I think, it's maybe time to get into the episode. So we didn't record last week, but we're back recording this week. We have been talking for a while in our previous episodes about neoliberalism and when that emerged and the impact that it's had on culture. Today, we're going to be focusing on how neoliberalism has spawned burnout culture.
Yes, very linked.
Yes, and you're going to sort of explore a few aspects of burnout that don't often get talked about.
Yeah, and I think as people listen to this, they'll start to see the sort of evidences of this all over the place. So just to, people who've joined us late in the game, which people do, the term neoliberalism refers to, I guess, the economic and political order that really has emerged in the world since, the sort of you could sort of argue the end of the sort of 70s up until recently. I think we're coming to the sort of possibly the end of it. But really it's sort of an economic order which, believes that the sort of economy is the best thing to sort of, drive society. But also alongside that, there's a lot of sort of government control also of the economy. And we saw this sort of revolution with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, as sort of mediating institutions were sort of pushed back on, and a kind of sort of radical individualism was encouraged. And that would drive the low productivity that the West was experiencing. But very much in the background of that story is also the story of burnout. And burnout is a word that we use a lot, and particularly since, I think the last couple of years, you've heard the term burnout used. But in many ways, it begins to sort of emerge in the 80s, and it parallels the emergence of sort of the high performance culture that neoliberalism encourages. And you begin to see these stories in the press in the 1980s of executives, and they called things like the yuppie flu. And sort of burnout and fatigue and stress that's created by operating at a really high level and working lots of hours. There's definitely sort of a cultural shift that begins to happen in the 1980s. And, you can even see this in sort of popular music as sort of bands begin to, dress in suits and slick their hair back, and almost sort of the character Gordon Gekko from Wall Street becomes almost the sort of icon. He was actually a sort of a cautionary figure that Oliver Stone created. But, you begin to see this sort of high performance becomes part of the culture, but it's very much still in the space of work.
Yes.
And all of a sudden you've got the executive who's working long hours and traveling lots, but also playing squash and jogging. And, there's almost sort of a warrior element to it. Even think of like women's fashion and men's suits with, shoulder pads and, sort of going into battle and corporate takeovers. And it's very sort of ego driven and sort of like a sort of dominant sort of almost war sort of vision, and, so these articles start to come about people having heart attacks, people becoming burnt out. Now, you can go back a little bit earlier, like, you begin to have in that sort of 19th century sort of reports as the contemporary world begins of conditions like, I think they called it neurasthenia, which was sort of like this sort of new kind of condition that, people in places like economic and financial centers like New York and the City of London experienced as they worked so much and dealt with lots of information in this new non-stop world, which the Telegraph ticker explaining what the New York Stock Exchange, it kept going, in London after people, clocked off at 5 p.m. or whatever. And a lot of the sort of early language around this was also sort of linked to some sort of pseudosciences, like the sort of science of vitalism, that people believed that there was sort of these different energies inside people, and managing those energies was really important. You get to sort of the 80s, and there's a sort of culture around people, and there's all kinds of like corporate retreat centers start to emerge. Places like the Esalen Institute in Northern California, which sort of takes almost this, it starts as almost a sort of counterculture hippie sort of retreat center, but then they start to open up to sort of executives and yuppies, and you sort of get this like almost a lifestyle executive sort of like high performance sort of way of living your life. So that's sort of like the first most basic understanding I would give sort of like burnout, of working too much in high pressure, stressed environments, and you see this in places like Japan, where you had the salary men who were, the stories in Japan of people, who would work 12 hours and then commute, 2 hours and then drop dead at their desk, some sort of burnout. And sort of that Japan was a country very much shaped by neoliberalism and had a very large corporate structure as Japan was economically growing in the 1980s. And there was a book, this very much came into, as Christians started to look at a lot of business literature in the 1980s around getting tips of how to lead. And I think it was Arch Hart. Can I get a fact check on this? Arch Hart, I think, was a professor at Fuller looking at, I think it was maybe like counseling or psychology at Fuller, wrote a book on adrenaline. And, how basically you can become burnt out when your adrenal system sort of diminishes. And the idea that, humans are built to, there's the flight or fight mechanism. And what this sort of like high levels of working was doing was meaning we were burning out the adrenaline that was used for flight or fight situations. Yeah. Is that correct, Daniel? Is it Arch Hart?
Yeah, Archibald Hart. He was served at the faculty, Fuller Seminary, Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy.
Yeah. And I think he wrote in that book, he talked about stuff. I think one of the points he made was that a lot of ministers and pastors commit moral failures or have these sort of down moments on Monday after the adrenaline of Sunday has crashed, and then they're more likely to do something. So, he sort of encouraged lots of pastors to change their day off from Monday to Friday. So if you ever had that idea, that's really where the origins of that. So that's sort of like our sort of basic, been around for a while understanding of burnout culture. But I want to sort of explore some other elements because I think that's early neoliberalism, but things have changed. But many people, as we talk about burnout culture, still bring that framework to it, basically working too hard under too much stress for too long.
Yeah. Okay, so the next one that you want to unpack is the burnout of overabundance.
Yeah, so I think what happens is we begin to move away from this overwork. Are there still people who are experiencing that 100%? But definitely you begin to sort of see, a pushback around working so many hours. I think France, I can't remember when it was like 7 years ago, began to sort of look at a reduced hour week, so the sort of world was changed by the invention of the 40-hour week, which I think actually started in Melbourne, if I could be wrong about that, this concept that workers should only work 40 hours a week, should have, Saturday and all this sort of stuff. And France, I think was exploring the 30-hour week, or people looking at 4-day weeks. So there's a question around. I think France also instigated some laws around bosses couldn't email people, outside of working hours and stuff like this. So you start to see in the literature sort of a pushback on this working too many hours. But then as we sort of get into, the later stages of neoliberalism, one of the things that neoliberalism does, particularly aligned with the birth of, internet, social media, and particularly online shopping, is this sense that people become burnt out by overabundance. Byung-Chul Han wrote a book called Burnout Society, which I think I quoted back in maybe Disappearing Church, the book I wrote several books ago, and he talks about the fact that neoliberalism, he also wrote another book called Psychopolitics, which talks about this, that more in depth as it links to neoliberalism. But in a sense, society moved from, what Foucault called a disciplinary society, where you were kept in check, told what to do, there were taboos, to a society which is more based around an excess of freedom. So in this society of excess freedom, there was more and more opportunities to do things. We've talked also about that sort of economic period, Melvin King, the former Chancellor of the Bank of England, talked about, the nice period, no inflation, constant expansion. And during that time, as China bought a lot of products online, the internet boom, there was sort of this period of economic sort of growth in the West. There was just more and more consumer items to buy, but not only more and more consumer items to buy, because what the internet did is the natural boundaries that were around the experience of shopping disappeared.
Yeah.
So in the past, you might still spend all day at the mall, but there was a point where the mall shut. Whereas what online shopping did is that it brought the endless possibility of continually going through options.
Yes.
And almost exhausting yourself. So this Barney Schwartz wrote a book called The Choice Paradox, and he talked about the fact that we were being almost oppressed by too much choice. So another form of burnout is the burnout that has come in later neoliberalism of overabundance, where you want to go on a holiday. And in the past, you want to go into a holiday, you'd go to your local travel agent and you'd book it, and they go, here's the things. You might come back, get your ticket.
Yeah.
You might have a brochure you look at, but there's a point where you get to the end of the brochure. But now you want to book the holiday. You're booking the flights online. You're looking at TripAdvisor. You're looking at what hotels, and then you see something on Instagram about, don't go to this hotel. And it just becomes this hugely exhausting thing, whether you're booking a holiday, buying a new car, buying a pair of trousers, that there's this sense of overabundance. Instead of the restaurant you should go to in the city, which restaurant, which cuisine, which part of the city do you want to go to? Your friend said this, you read this, it's just this constant overabundance everywhere.
Yeah. And I think I've been reflecting on this the last couple of weeks and seeing it for myself and for others. It feels like it's more magnified now that we are, a couple of years out of COVID, where for a period of time, we weren't as overwhelmed with those choices.
Yes.
I get up in the morning and I'm going to work from home and I'm going to eat at home and, just go about this very contained life. But now that everything's returned, it's almost like the rose-colored glasses are off and you're seeing life for what it is,
Yes.
and all of these constant demands, and you just feel so exhausted. And I've regularly found myself being like, why am I so tired? I was never like this before. And, I'm getting older, so maybe that's a contributing factor. I'm willing to acknowledge that. But, like how much is this notion of overabundance impacting us?
And so, it's been an economy of overabundance, and that will create problems of overabundance.
Yeah.
And, I think you bring up a really good point here, though, that we've seen an increase in the conversation around burnout culture with the pause that happened because of COVID. Because I think when people are in the midst of it all, you don't notice it, it's what you do. And then people stopped, and then it was a moment of re-examination that occurred. And also, there was a kind of acceleration that did occur because you couldn't go to, a store to look at something.
Yeah.
During COVID, there was also there was a slowing down, but also an acceleration of online, which happened as well.
That's true.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's look at the third one. So firstly, we had working too many hours. Then we've got the burnout of overabundance, and now the burnout of self-creation.
Yeah. So one of the things that sort of, we talked previously about neoliberalism and the second individualism. The first individualism was people moving from a very rigid hierarchical order where they discovered self-mobility and a freedom from the way they were defined by that rigid order, which, we see in the 1700s, 1800s. But in the sort of second individualism, really the individual is, free to self-create. And this is very much encouraged. So the individual is constantly working at the project of self-creation. How do others see me? What is my identity? I'm no longer defined in the same way by where I was born and these issues which were inherited, now you can shape them yourself. And again, to consumer culture, the internet has just accelerated this. So this constant sense that we're on a stage, we're constantly being examined, we're constantly putting out an image to the world.
Yes.
In, sort of the beginnings of, the first stages of neoliberalism, very much marketing comes into its fore, and public relations and companies and causes market themselves to the world. But in later sort of neoliberalism, the individual markets themselves to the world, and you have to self-present your own personal, private, public relations firm. And I think people don't realize how exhausting this is. So the work of self-creation never stops, because fads and fashions come and go. Issues even are linked, like what is this particular political issue that what would that say about myself versus it just being about the issue in itself. And, the culture has no lack of generating new identities, new opportunities for you to broadcast yourself. And this is also a kind of work. And what's interesting as well is I realize this is what this does. Like, think about this. It turns pleasure into work. Because just say you've got an incredible meal. Just say, 20 years ago, you're invited to an incredible meal and it's just fantastic and you're with these great people and the sun's going down perfectly and you're there and you the only way to live through that moment is to experience it. And if it's pretty darn good, you just go, okay, well, I'm going to take this in and appreciate it. But now because you have the ability to broadcast that, how do you capture it? And, you now see when you sort of travel around the world at different sort of tourist hotspots, or you see in a restaurant when someone has a fantastic meal brought before them, or you see a beautiful sunset, you see people laboring to take the right photo, to capture that and communicate that. And so basically pleasure gets turned into content creation.
Yeah.
And creation's a form of work. And so even this form of people almost performing to the way you should be responding to a moment of pleasure. So they become scripted. Here's me at the festival. Oh, we're having a great time. Here I'm at the Taylor Swift concert. I'm so happy. Do you know what I mean? And it's just a fascinating dynamic where it actually starts to work against the sort of early modern, not so much, first stage neoliberalism was very much around hedonism and, where this is still hedonistic, but it's like a rote form of hedonism and it's a work of hedonism where pleasure must be done, and the classic example too was Burning Man this year, where it was flooded and horrendous, and there was sort of people, there was like some Aussies wrote some article for the paper, like, we're at Burning Man, but we're still just trying to enjoy ourselves. It was almost them saying, we are enjoying ourselves. This is the Lord of the Flies, but please understand, Australia, we flew all the way over here, but we're still enjoying it, and I was like, this is just exhausting. So there's an exhaustion that comes from the pursuit of pleasure, but the pursuit of pleasure as part of your self-creation.
And it's kind of like a vicious cycle, right? Because we then consume that which others are putting out there, and then feel inclined to do the same.
Yes.
And then there's just this never-ending hamster wheel of creation that doesn't achieve anything.
And there's also an exhaust, 100%. There's also an exhaust. Yeah, so it's a hamster because it disappears. Like it's ephemeral, like it's digital.
Yes.
Like, and in 3 years, no one cares. You may look back on your iPhone memories, something comes up, and but the legitimacy of that information. Douglas Rushkoff talked about in his book Future Shock, I think, or wasn't Future Shock because that was Alvin Toffler. He wrote a book on this idea that information in the digital age has relevance for just a moment.
Yes.
I've talked before about the guy who live tweeted the US raid on bin Laden's sort of hiding place in Abbottabad in Pakistan, how for a moment everyone was looking at his Twitter account, and he got all these followers, but as soon as that event was over, he became irrelevant.
Yes.
But for a moment he was important because he had, it was new. There was a novelty to the information he creates. Yeah. So same thing. Yeah, no one cares if you're at the concert 10 years later. You might, but they go back to being your memories. But for a moment, they're relevant. So you got to drive it, and where it goes that viral moment. What was the book you wrote?
Third Wave.
No.
Power Shift. Revolutionary Wealth. War and Anti-War. Creating a New Civilization.
Oh, he's written lots of books.
Lots of books.
We'll put it in the notes.
Douglas. What was his
Douglas
name?
Rushkoff.
Oh, hang on. I'm looking at Alvin Toffler. Sorry.
No, not Albert Toffler.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I was just going to say as well, just on that, I had an example of this last week. You were talking about the cyclical thing.
Yeah.
I suppose from a different angle, I went on a trip up to Sydney and was driving up there and was just on the call with someone while I was driving. And I was just saying, I'm driving through country, New South Wales, and da-da-da. And they're like, I'm so jealous. and I kind of like, interesting comment. And then later on, I was at a brewery having a beer and sent a picture of hey, I'm about this person really likes craft beer and whatever. And their response was, so jealous, wish I could be there. And it just kind of struck me. I'm like, that's such for me, like as it's kind of a little bit of it's kind of like the likes, I suppose, and the comments, but it was just in a relationship with someone I know. But it's kind of that dopamine, like,
yes.
But
something that I'm doing is of value to someone else. Yeah.
But it's just interesting, like even just the word jealous, I'm like, that's not a good word.
No,
but we've somehow, that's now become a positive way of kind of engaging and like affirming someone. I'm like, I feel jealous because you're doing that. Anyway, it's just an interesting kind of moment.
Yes.
And just how these things they actually begin to shape our identity and they're not good things.
Yeah. I think it kind of comes back to something that we talked about early on, like a number of months ago, when you were talking about the nature of competition and how neoliberalism has kind of made us compete socially. In so many different contexts. It's kind of that.
Which burns you out.
Yeah.
Like if you're continually at war, social war, or continually competing, that is exhausting because you can never rest.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting too. I'll come back to that point. Let me make a point about Sabbath in a second. One other point I wanted to add too was I think someone wrote in, Daniel, to us and just asked the question around shame and how, particularly some of these issues we're talking about links back to shame, and particularly in sort of cultures like Chinese cultures or Korean cultures, Japanese cultures, which have been shaped by Confucian thought. And, very much I think that people are right. I've had multiple people notice this. We're almost returning to a kind of honor shame culture. But how I would say it's different to sort of Confucian concepts of shame, and Confucian is, to the classical Chinese philosopher Confucius, is that's almost a disciplinarian society concept of shame, where this person has shame because they broke that taboo, or they didn't live up to the family's expectation in this, or here's this cultural norm that has been broken. And then often that is fear around exclusion, or exclusion for one's wider sort of family group or people group that you're part of. What this is based around is less a sort of disciplinary society. It's more the shame that what I'm projecting to the world doesn't align up with the reality.
Yeah.
The mother and father who are filming their kids who at the park for Instagram, and it all looks amazing. And then on the way home, the kids are acting up and it's a nightmare, and someone sees them and they're like, oh, wow, what I'm putting out doesn't align with who I really am.
Yes.
And that, I think it's more around the shame. It's more a neoliberal competition.
Yes.
I'm a fraud because I put this out to the world and it's not really true. And someone may discover that, and I'm going to get caught out. So it's less I'll get caught out and bring shame upon my family because we didn't live up to these Confucian standards. It's I got caught out and I'll bring shame on myself because I don't live up to the standards of 21st century neoliberal society or economy or whatever.
Yeah. Which is all identity stuff. It's not
100%.
It's not just it's shifted from like a participation in community thing and my role in community to now like my identity is because of these things.
Yes.
And if I can't live up to that, then that brings shame, which it has so many implications. And
the sort of Confucian idea of shame also is very much linked to a collectiveness, a communalness. You brought shame on us. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I remember, I think it was at Virginia Tech, there was a maths tutor who was a Korean student. And I remember in Korea, there was in Seoul, there was like people, I think maybe their family or people came forward and sort of like publicly gave this apology and like we have, this has brought shame on us. And that's very different to what we're talking about here, which is a much more individualistic sense of shame. And look, there are get all technical, there are individualistic elements of shame in Confucian concept of shame. But I think, at a broad level, I think this is much more individualistic.
Is there anything more you wanted to explore for that one?
I was just going to say on Sabbath too, like I think, and I'll dig into this a bit more. Like I think one of the things that, and maybe I'll make this point here, that I think one of the mistakes that people can make at the moment is that because burnout is everywhere in the culture, it's very much in the Christian world, is that one of the elements of Sabbath is, well, I'll rest.
Yes.
But there's also another element of Sabbath is also that I am, like if you look at God was able to rest on the seventh day because he had created the world. And there's an element there that there's chaos at the beginning of scriptures, the unformed earth, the Spirit of God hovers over it. And there is this concept called the chaos camp in German, the struggle with chaos. And very much in the sort of ancient Near East, there was this motif where a god would come and defeat chaos, and chaos was its enemy. And then after the defeating of chaos, the god could rest. The biblical story very much sort of plays off that, subverts it. And, in a sense, you have these sort of imagery of sort of David having defeated his enemies. He can sort of rest in Jerusalem. And so there's this concept of Sabbath is very much theologically about the defeat of one's enemies so one can truly rest. Now, if you're stopping doing as much and taking Sabbath, but then the internal enemies and the concept of competition is there, you can not have your phone. You can go and sit in the mountains, but you're not truly at a biblical sense of Sabbath because you're in a war of all against all in a great neoliberal competition with yourself and with others. Oh. So you can do the whole Sabbath thing and not find true rest because you've not actually dug down to the deepest roots of our true social condition.
Well, we can just end the episode then.
Because what you're doing in a sense, you're doing furniture moving. You're moving the chairs on you're moving the deck chairs on the Titanic. You're not actually dealing with the root of the cause.
Yeah.
And see, this is where I think it's really important to differentiate, because I think what we can do is we can experience burnout, and because of our cultural understanding of what is the cause of burnout comes from that first phase of neoliberalism, where it's working 80 hours a week.
Yes.
And look, I was speaking to a pastor, recently retired pastor who's a baby boomer, and he sort of made the comment to me, we work, pastors work 80, 90 hours a week or something like this. And I was thinking, well, to be honest, a lot of the young pastors I know don't do that.
Yeah.
Yet they still feel burnt out.
Yeah.
This is why, I've met people who are working 3 days a week and they're like, I'm totally burnt out.
Yes.
Something here is not about
Yeah.
working 80 hours a week and burning out, high stress. Are there people out there listening who that may be true? 100%.
Yep.
But I would posit in this that I wonder whether many people who are talking about burnout, looking to retreat, looking to try and get more restful patterns, and they're doing that by actually working less, that's not actually the cause of what's happening. The actual burnout is later neoliberalism
Yes.
of overabundance and self-creation. But there's more.
There's another one. Yes. The last one that you want to explore is the burnout of the fear of difficulty.
Yeah, I think I mentioned Mark Fisher, the former late British cultural critic and blogger. Talked about I think he called it depressive hedonia. Which is a very technical academic term. And what he meant by that is that he found that people today, and he talked about, I think I did talk about this when I talked about teachers. Teachers today are stuck in this bind of having to teach kids really important stuff, but then also entertain them.
Yep.
And Fisher talked about that. And he said part of the problem is that people today, this is another way in which hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, has changed. Hedonism's less like, I'm going to break away from the disciplinary society like a hippie and just enjoy pure pleasure. It's more you're expected to continually be in pleasure. So the sort of contemporary person is, always playing a computer game, always, smoking dope, always just, promiscuous sex. It's just like, I'm doing this because this is what you're meant to do. And to not be in a state where I'm experiencing some kind of pleasure would mean that something's wrong. So unless I'm continually, to read a book is just too much. To do a job where I'm bored, there's something wrong. So boredom, difficulty, challenge, all these things become signals that you're not experiencing something pleasurable and entertaining. So something must be wrong. So this means that you then become tremendously afraid of difficulty. But again, to work, to build something in the world, you're inevitably going to experience difficulty.
Yeah.
And so I think we're also seeing this thing where people are saying, I'm burnt out, I started this job and, there's this person on my team and they're an absolute nightmare and I'm trying to work that through. I'm in conflict with this person. I'm just burnt out by this. Again, this is not a burnout that comes from working 80 hours a week because, you're a flight traffic controller and it's just super stressful. This is a burnout which comes from, I don't have a framework for dealing with the difficulty that building something brings.
Yes.
And because we've also been told, is a parallel to this conversations around burnout, is also conversations around social anxiety, is the world of human relationships has become one where the burnout culture language is put over it because we have not been taught. Because again, neoliberalism, go back and listen to all the episodes, is something which creates greater social disconnection.
Yes.
So therefore, we've not been adequately shaped with how to relate to other people. So even that becomes a form of stress.
Yes.
But it's not Japanese salaryman collapsing at his desk, exhaustion. This is an exhaustion because we've not been formed to actually work through difficulty.
Yeah. And it kind of also connects back to the sermon series that you've been doing at Red, Platforms to Pillars, and the nature of a pillar is something that, where you were talking before, that your dad was saying a pillar is something that withstands stress.
Yeah.
And if God is building his people to be pillars, we must be persevering and enduring challenges, which is something that we're really not set up for.
No. And one of the sort of like things I'm seeing and the questions I get asked from some younger leaders is sort of, how do I do ministry and not get burnt out? Now, the old answer is, well, don't work 8 hours a week. Don't do this in your own strength. Make sure you be praying and you have intimacy with God and you've got a good work-life balance. But the danger is the work-life balance language and the burnout language then also doesn't address these other three that we've dealt with here.
Yes.
And, someone could work a day a week, and if you've got to confront someone in that day a week or work through a difficult situation or experience pushback from your peers or lead a project from start where you've got to win people over and you're going to have enemies. We talked about, that book Leadership on the Line where it says if you're going to lead people into growth, you are going to experience backlash and difficulty.
Yes.
And I think part of the danger is, people sometimes say, look, I want to avoid stress. And people go, oh, look, there's positive stress. And the athlete who's about to do a high jump, they might feel nervousness. That's positive stress. But what I want to say here is I don't know how you do ministry without not just positive stress, but negative stress.
Yeah.
Now, there is a thing where, we need to give everything to God and let him carry everything. But we are, in the now and not yet.
Yeah.
And you're going to experience conflict. You're going to experience suffering. For me, I think about this last season, and it really struck me where, we've been through a difficult period at church, coming out of COVID, other stuff, all the stuff that happens in ministry, and then in the midst of that, my wife gets this, cancer diagnosis and, stage 4 cancer diagnosis. And it was really interesting, people often in very helpful ways would sort of say, have you spoken to someone or, how do you find rest in the midst? I'm just like, there's just no chance. I remember, I had to, when Trudy was going through chemotherapy, I had to do all the stuff for the kids. You're looking after your wife, you're doing all this, leading the church. There was no way that I could have constructed all of that to be this life-giving arrangement of rest and work-life balance. Trudy was in hospital at times. And I think it just really said something to me that I think there's a huge danger at the moment that we can see that there's almost a myth that can appear in reaction to some bad habits of the past that one can do missional ministry and do that in this find the perfect arrangement, life hacks.
Yeah.
And where you're not going to experience some pretty significant stress and or suffering and difficulty.
Yeah.
And, I think that part of saying yes to God is that it's yes to that, and I think that's very biblical.
100%. It's all throughout Scripture.
Yes.
I think of James 1 in particular, but then as you were talking, I thought of something else, but I'll just read out part of James 1. That many will know. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. It doesn't say that you might. It assumes that you will, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And it goes on. That whole passage is really great. But then it also makes me think of the Psalm 1 passage that we've talked about before. And, you could read the Psalm 1 passage and think about, I'm going to be a tree planted by streams of living water and I'm just going to live my life at the river. But living your life at the river is a posture of your heart rather than creating circumstances that mean that you are not facing stress, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And also that passage also talks about bearing fruit or, I think in different seasons.
Yielding fruit in season,
And there's going to be difficult seasons. And I think one of the dangers is that at a moment where I see such a tremendous opportunity in the world, missionally, I think there is an evangelistic opportunity as people are questioning all of this cultural order stuff that we've spoken about, is that at a moment where, in a sense, the kingdom needs to advance and go forward, not in our own strength, not by working 90 hours a week, not by, not resting and never seeing your kid or, doing 1 million flights a year or anything like that. But at this moment of advancing, as the kingdom of God is advancing in the world, in his power, not in our strength, in his, that in reaction to some of these cultural issues, we retreat.
Yes.
And you need the moments. I talked about, again, I think it was back in Disappearing Church, Toynbee's withdrawal retreat pattern, which we see.
Yes.
But also part of that withdrawing was also withdrawing in order to see some of the idols of the culture. And actually withdrawing, as Toynbee talked about it, was actually a posture of marginalization sometimes. And I look at that and I, see that, often marginalized communities actually can teach the broader community about the prophetic positioning because they've not been at the center of the culture. So I think that there is a sense that, God, and again, too, like this is so nuanced and again, we don't paint with a broad brushstroke here that applies to every single person. But I do think that there is a danger that at this moment you see in the culture this sense of, there's all these trends, quiet quitting, the great resignation, go slow, work your wage.
Yeah, you were talking about Snail Girl.
Snail Girl this week. This honestly, and they're making up one a week here. And, as this Snail Girl was go to snail's pace in reaction to working too much. And I get it. Like I think the corporate thing of working 8 hours a week and using people as high performance, we spoke about this series, like humans reach a level of productivity. They can't go above that by working more hours. And, there is this sort of Silicon Valley, almost now new sort of like salary man type, I don't know, Elon Musk sort of crazy type figure who just does all this stuff. But the danger is we overcompensate in the other direction.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'd just like to say too is I'm very aware that a lot of these trends work if you're a white collar worker. And you work at a place which has got a great HR department, and lots of staff. And in a time of sort of low unemployment because of the demographic changes, we've spoken about this, that the danger is that we have to realize that there is a certain privilege around this. If you're working on a factory floor, if you're a concreter, and you tell your boss and you've got to lay concrete at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning and you go, I'm just going to go slow as we're doing this. You can't go slow laying concrete, So there is an element to, we have to be very careful that many people who also then do serve in places where, I worked for, the Salvation Army for 10 years and, there's elements where, people who live on the street and in hugely addictive backgrounds, there's an element where, yes, you need your moments of retreat, but it's not normal hours. You know what I mean? Like, if you're caring for someone in a laneway in downtown who is overdosing, you can't, it's time to go home now. Sorry, guy. So, I just think it's important to understand that God actually builds us in moments of difficulty. So I think it's the two. Yes. I think this is a balance. Do we need, we need rest, we need retreat, 100%. But it's also a balance that also there's going to be times of difficulty, but actually that difficulty grows us in perseverance. And, part of my sense is that a lot of people who have experienced that difficulty over the last few years, that actually, we've seen in our church tremendous spiritual growth we were reflecting on in our team meeting this morning, which a lot of that has come through difficulties we and as a team and as a congregation have gone through. And there's no way out of that. It's walking into that with God. That's what it is to be human, but it's also what it is to be a human that God is transforming as he uses things to create not pleasure, but as James said there, perseverance.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a really helpful way to expand our understanding of burnout, and we hope and pray that it's given you a bit more insight into looking at how perhaps you might be experiencing burnout in your own circumstances and perhaps how to approach it, and how to seek rest and find your deep roots in Jesus. Yeah.
Can I even add to, I think
Sure.
it's just as you said there, I think it's seeking rest, but it's also seeking work.
Go on. Yeah.
In Genesis, God creates Adam and Eve and he gives them this mandate, and Adam and Eve are given this task to, like God, brings order out of chaos. Empowered by the Spirit, we're called to bring order out of chaos. That's what we call it, steward creation. And so chaotic situations that may be filled with pain and difficulty and building anything of worth, partnering with God in the kingdom means you sort of, in a sense, come up against chaos. And this is how great things are built. And I think that we're in a moment where, this podcast is called Rebuilders because there's a moment of rebuilding and there's a moment of building. And so I think you're right. We need to find the patterns between rest and work.
Yeah.
And I just want to just say that I think there's lots of people, there are people listening out there to the rest element, and I 100% want to affirm that.
Yeah.
But I also just want to challenge people out there that maybe because of everything you've been seeing in the culture and the sense out there at the moment is like, I need to rest. What if there's actually some work that God has before you, great projects, and you're scared and and you know it's going to be difficult, but actually with God, he's calling you into that because that's what he does, because we're part of his great commission, his great mission in the world to be full of mercy and justice and to share his good news. And so let's rest. Let's also get to work.
You know what Jesus says in John 16, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world.
Boom.
We'll catch you guys next time.